The siege of Eger, one of the most savage defensive victories in the long war between Christian Europe and the Ottoman Empire. In 1552, the Turks unleashed 40,000 soldiers on a single Hungarian fortress, elite infantry, veteran cavalry, and siege cannons so powerful they could reduce stone walls to rubble in hours. Eger had barely 2,000 defenders. No relief army was coming. No escape route existed. By every military calculation, Eger should have fallen in days. The Turks had crushed larger fortresses with smaller armies. This was supposed to be routine. It wasn't. Behind those walls stood people who had already decided they would rather die than run. Soldiers who fought until their arms went numb and their swords bent from overuse. Civilians, women, children, priests, who hauled stones and boiling water to the ramparts while cannonballs crashed around them, and a young inventor whose crude, untested weapons would turn the Turks' confident advance into screaming chaos. What should have been a massacre became a nightmare for the attackers. A fortress that should have surrendered in a week held for 39 brutal days. And when the dust finally settled, 40,000 Turkish soldiers were retreating from 2,000 Hungarians who refused to break. To understand how Eger became one of the most unlikely stands in military history, you have to understand the world it was trying to protect, and just how close that world was to disappearing forever. For decades, Hungary had been dying. Not quickly, not cleanly, but slowly, fortress by fortress, valley by valley, year by year. A generation earlier, at the Battle of Mohacs, the Hungarian army had been annihilated in a single afternoon. The king fell. One piece fell directly under Ottoman rule, another reached desperately toward the Habsburgs, trading independence for survival. And everything in between became a wasteland, burned villages, empty roads, refugees dragging what little they owned toward borders that kept shrinking. Each year the Turkish frontier crept northward. Each year another fortress that had seemed untouchable sent smoke rising into the sky. Buda, the proud capital, was already gone. Székesfehérvár, Veszprém, Pécs. Names that had once meant safety now marked the grave sites of Hungarian resistance. The crescent banners climbed higher. The shadow stretched longer. And by the autumn of 1552, that shadow was about to fall on Eger. North of the crumbling frontier lay Hungary's last great treasure, the mining towns. Silver. Enough silver to pay armies, bribe allies, and keep kingdoms alive. If those mines fell, the Habsburgs would bleed, not just soldiers, but coin, influence, and the will to keep fighting. And standing between the Turks and that silver was a single hilltop fortress, guarding the northern roads like a lone gatekeeper. Eger, a place so small that foreign generals barely bothered to learn its name. It wasn't a mighty citadel or a grand strategic capital. It was a quiet stronghold surrounded by vineyards and wheat fields, a place where farmers lived beside soldiers, where priests walked the same narrow streets as blacksmiths and merchants. The people there had no illusions about what was coming. They had seen the refugees on the roads. They had heard the stories of burning towns. They had watched distant smoke curl upward from fortresses that had once seemed invincible, and now that smoke was coming for them. The nobility scattered, and the kingdom itself cracked apart like dropped pottery. The death of Hungary didn't happen all at once. It happened in stages, each one more brutal than the last, each one stripping away another piece of what the kingdom had once been. It started at Mohacs. In 1526, on a rain-soaked plain in southern Hungary, King Louis II led his army against the Ottoman Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent. It was supposed to be the battle that would stop the Turkish advance, the moment Hungary proved it could still fight. Instead, it became a slaughter. The Ottomans didn't just defeat the Hungarian army, they annihilated it. 20,000 soldiers fell in less than 2 hours. The king himself, only 20 years old, drowned fleeing the battlefield when his horse stumbled into a swollen stream. His body wasn't found for months. With the king dead and the army destroyed, Hungary cracked apart like a dropped mirror. The nobles who survived couldn't agree on anything, not a new king, not a strategy, not even which side to beg for help. One faction turned to the Habsburgs, trading sovereignty for protection. Another accepted Ottoman overlordship, becoming a puppet state. and the land caught between them became a bleeding wound, a frontier where villages burned, fields went unplanted, and the only constant was the slow, relentless northward creep of Turkish control. Year after year, the frontier shrank. Fortresses that had stood for generations fell one by one. Peks, Székesfehérvár, Esztergom. Each name had once meant safety, strength, permanence. Now they were just markers on a map showing how much had been lost. And in 1541, the greatest loss of all, Buda, the capital, the heart of the kingdom, surrendered without a fight. The Turks marched in, raised their banners over the royal palace, and made it clear that Hungary, as it had existed, was finished. By 1552, what remained of Hungarian resistance was scattered and desperate. The Habsburgs controlled the western edges, the Ottomans held the centre and south, and in between, a handful of fortresses still flew Christian banners, isolated, undersupplied, knowing that sooner or later the Turks would come for them too. Among those fortresses was Eger. It sat on a hilltop in the northern highlands, a small stronghold surrounded by vineyards and farmland. It wasn't famous. It wasn't strategically critical, at least not until you looked at what lay beyond it. North of Eger stretched the mining towns, Selmecbánya, Körmökbánya, Besztercebánya, silver, copper, wealth enough to fund armies and prop up empires. The Habsburgs needed that silver to keep fighting. The Ottomans wanted it to break them, and Eger was the gate, a single fortress, barely fortified, guarding the only passable roads into the mining region. If Eger fell, the mines would follow. If the mines fell, the Habsburgs would bleed money they couldn't afford to lose. And if the Habsburgs bled out, there would be nothing left to stop the Turkish advance into the heart of Europe. The people of Eger understood this. They had watched the kingdom collapse around them. They had seen the refugees, heard the stories, counted the fortresses that no longer answered. They knew what was coming, they just didn't know when. The Ottoman Empire didn't conquer by accident, it conquered by system, a machine of war so vast, so organized, so relentlessly efficient that most enemies broke before the first sword was drawn. And in the autumn of 1552, that machine turned its attention northward. The target was obvious. Beyond the crumbling Hungarian frontier lay the mining towns, Selmecbánya, Körmökbánya, and the others, pumping silver and copper into Habsburg coffers. That silver paid soldiers. It bought alliances. It kept Christian Europe in the fight. If the Ottomans could seize those mines, they wouldn't just gain wealth. They would bleed their enemies dry, and the only thing standing in the way was Eger. Sultan Süleyman himself approved the campaign. Two of his most experienced commanders would lead it, Ahmed Pasha, the Beylerbey of Rumelia, and Ali Pasha, a veteran of sieges across 3 continents. Between them, they had broken more fortresses than most generals had ever seen. They knew exactly how this would go. Eger was small. Eger was isolated. Eger would fall like all the others. The army they assembled was staggering. 40,000 men, Janissaries, Sipahi cavalry, Azab infantry, engineers, sappers, artillerymen, gathered on the plains south of the frontier. It wasn't just an army, it was a moving city, tent makers and cooks, blacksmiths and physicians, muleteers driving endless lines of supply wagons. The logistics alone would have overwhelmed most kingdoms. And then there were the guns. Ottoman artillery was the terror of Europe. Massive bronze cannons, some weighing several tons, capable of hurling stone balls that could punch through walls, medieval engineers had never imagined defending against. Teams of oxen and camels dragged these monsters northward, their wheels cutting deep ruts into roads that had never borne such weight. Smaller field guns followed, dozens of them, along with mortars, ammunition wagons, and the engineers who knew exactly where to place each weapon for maximum destruction. The column stretched for miles. From a distance it looked less like an army and more like a migration, a slow, unstoppable tide flowing toward its destination. Drums rolled to keep the marching rhythm. Banners snapped in the wind, hundreds of them, the crescent and star repeated endlessly down the line. Scouts rode ahead, mapping routes, identifying water sources, reporting back on the fortress that waited in the hills. Ahmed Pasha and Ali Pasha reviewed the intelligence and saw nothing to concern them. Eger's walls were old, its garrison was small. No relief force was within striking distance. The mathematics were simple: apply pressure, break the walls, accept the surrender. They had done it dozens of times before. Some fortresses held for weeks, some collapsed in days. None had ever held against a force this size. The commanders expected to be finished before the winter snows arrived. They expected another name added to the empire's endless list of conquests. They expected Eger to be a footnote. They were wrong, but they didn't know that yet. The army marched north. And in Eger, people who had spent their lives watching fortresses fall began preparing to prove that this one would be different. When word reached the Hungarian nobles that a Turkish army of 40,000 was marching toward Eger, the first instinct for many was despair. The numbers were impossible. The fortress was small. Relief forces were scattered across the frontier, too far away to arrive in time. Some quietly suggested abandonment, pull back the garrison, save what soldiers they could, let the Turks have another empty fortress. But abandoning Eger meant abandoning the mines. And abandoning the mines meant abandoning any hope of continuing the war. They needed someone to hold the fortress, not a glory seeker who would charge out and die heroically in the first week, not a politician who would negotiate surrender the moment things looked grim. They needed a professional, someone who understood that sieges weren't won with bravery alone. They were won with logistics, discipline, and the cold-eyed willingness to endure what others couldn't. They chose István Dobó. Dobó wasn't famous. He wasn't the kind of commander whose name appeared in songs or whose victories were celebrated at court. What he had was a reputation for something rarer: composure. He had defended fortresses before. He had managed men under pressure. He understood that the difference between a garrison that held and a garrison that broke often came down to whether someone kept their head when everything was falling apart. He arrived at Eger in late summer and went straight to work. There were no speeches, no dramatic declarations. Dobó walked the walls from end to end, studying every section of stone, every gate, every tower. He counted the cannons, not enough. He inspected the powder stores, barely adequate. He reviewed the food supplies, the water sources, the medical provisions. He talked to the soldiers already stationed there, learning their strengths, identifying the weak links, calculating how many men he could actually rely on when the fighting started. He wasn't looking for reasons to feel confident. He was cataloguing vulnerabilities. The southern wall was the weakest, older construction, thinner stone, exposed to direct artillery fire from the hills beyond. The gates were solid, but would buckle under sustained bombardment. The garrison was small, barely 2,000 men when you counted everyone capable of holding a weapon. Ammunition would run low if the siege dragged on. Medical supplies were inadequate for the casualties a prolonged defense would produce. Dobó wrote it all down. Then he started building plans to address every single problem. He sent messages requesting reinforcements, knowing they probably wouldn't arrive. He ordered the walls reinforced in the weakest sections. He reorganized the garrison into units with clear responsibilities: who would defend which section, who would handle repairs, who would manage supplies. He established rotation so exhaustion wouldn't destroy discipline. He made it clear, without drama, that retreat was not an option. The men who watched him work began to understand something. Dobó wasn't optimistic. He wasn't pretending they would win easily. But he also wasn't afraid. He looked at the impossible situation in front of him and started solving problems, one at a time, and slowly that calm began to spread. The transformation began the day after Dobó took command, and it didn't stop until the Turkish army appeared on the horizon. Eger had always been a fortress, but it had never been tested against a force like this. The walls were old, built for a different era, when siege weapons were smaller and armies moved slower. The gates were sturdy, but showed their age. The garrison was undersized, the supplies were thin, and the layout had gaps that any competent engineer would exploit. Dobó saw all of this, and then he set about fixing it. The masons started on the southern wall. It was the weakest section, thinner stone, more exposed to direct fire from the surrounding hills. They worked from dawn until their hands bled, hauling fresh stone from nearby quarries, mixing mortar, reinforcing every section that showed cracks or wear. Where the wall couldn't be thickened, they built earthen ramparts behind it. packed dirt and timber that would absorb cannon fire better than stone alone. The carpenters worked alongside them. They reinforced the main gates with iron bracing, built secondary barricades inside the courtyard, and constructed wooden platforms along the walls so defenders could move quickly from one position to another. They built covers to protect soldiers from arrows and musket fire. They built frames to hold the heavy cauldrons that would pour boiling water and oil on anyone who reached the base of the walls. The blacksmiths never stopped. Day and night, the forges burned. Arrowheads by the thousands, spear points, sword repairs, armor patches for soldiers whose equipment had seen too many campaigns. The ring of hammers on metal became the heartbeat of the fortress, a constant reminder that preparation was still possible, that time hadn't run out yet. But it wasn't just the soldiers who worked. Dobó understood something that many commanders forgot. In a siege, everyone fights. The women of Eger organized the food stores, rationing supplies so they would last weeks instead of days. They filled every barrel and cistern with water, knowing the Turks would try to cut off outside sources. They prepared medical stations with bandages, herbs, and whatever medicines could be gathered, because casualties were coming, and the faster wounded men returned to the walls, the longer the fortress could hold. Even the children had roles. They carried stones to the ramparts, stacking ammunition for the defenders. They hauled sandbags to reinforce weak points. They ran messages between positions when adults couldn't be spared. No one was too young to contribute. No one was allowed to stand idle. And through all of it, the soldiers drilled. Dobó ran them through formations until the movements became instinct. He made them practice defending breaches, rotating positions, fighting in tight spaces. He wanted reactions, not thinking. When the chaos started, there wouldn't be time to figure things out. By the time scouts reported Turkish columns on the southern roads, Eger had become something different. It was still small. It was still outgunned, but it was no longer the sleepy fortress the Turks expected. It was ready to make them pay. While the soldiers drilled and the masons reinforced walls, a different kind of work was happening in a cramped workshop near the inner courtyard. Most people in Eger didn't know what was being built there. They just knew to stay away from the young man with powder-stained hands and the smell of sulphur clinging to his clothes. Gergely Bornemissza was not a soldier. He had never commanded men in battle, never led a charge, never stood on a wall as enemies climbed toward him. What he had was a mind that looked at gunpowder and saw possibilities that trained military men had never considered. The Turks had superior artillery. Everyone knew that. Their cannons could reduce stone walls to rubble. Their engineers could dig trenches and mining tunnels with practiced efficiency. Their infantry could absorb casualties and keep advancing because there were always more men behind them. Fighting the Ottomans with conventional weapons meant losing slowly instead of losing quickly. Bornemissza wanted to change the equation. He had been experimenting for months, working with whatever materials he could find or barter. The results were crude, nothing like the polished bronze cannons the Turks deployed, but they were designed to do something different, not to match Ottoman firepower, to disrupt it. The first weapons were the barrels, wooden casks packed with gunpowder, scrap metal, and flammable materials, sealed with pitch and fitted with fuses. They weren't meant to be fired from cannons. They were meant to be rolled down the slopes toward advancing infantry, bouncing and tumbling until they struck something solid and detonated. The Turks had never seen anything like them. They wouldn't know how to react. Then came the fire pots, clay containers filled with mixtures that ignited on impact. Oils, powders, resins that burned hot and clung to whatever they touched. Defenders could throw them from the walls into clusters of soldiers below. Even if they didn't kill, they would create chaos. Men on fire didn't hold formations. Men on fire screamed and ran. The most dangerous were the glass spheres, fragile containers packed with the most volatile powders Bornemissza could create, designed to shatter and explode in bursts of flame and shrapnel. They were unpredictable. Sometimes they worked perfectly, sometimes they fizzled, sometimes they detonated too early, but when they worked, they were devastating. Bornemissza brought his creations to Dobó as the Turkish artillery was taking position on the hills. He didn't promise miracles. He explained what the weapons could do, admitted their limitations, and made a simple argument. The Turks expected a conventional defense. They had broken conventional defenses 100 times. If Eger was going to survive, it needed to be something they hadn't prepared for. Dobó studied the weapons. He asked questions about reliability, about safety, about how they would be deployed. Then he gave his approval. It was a gamble. Bornemisza's devices had never been tested in actual combat. They might fail completely, they might kill defenders as easily as attackers, but the alternative was fighting 40,000 men with 2,000 and hoping discipline alone would be enough. Discipline wouldn't be enough. Dobó knew that. He needed an edge. The Inventor's fire would have to provide it. The first cannon fired at dawn. The sound reached the fortress before the impact did, a deep, hollow boom that rolled across the valley like distant thunder. Then the wall shook. Stone chips exploded from the southern rampart, scattering across the battlements like shrapnel. Dust billowed into the morning air. And before the defenders could process what had happened, the second gun fired, then the third, then a dozen more. The bombardment had begun. The Turkish artillery worked with mechanical precision. Each gun crew knew exactly what they were doing. Load, aim, fire, repeat. The rhythm was relentless, a steady percussion of destruction that hammered the same sections of wall over and over. The southern face took the worst of it. Every impact sent tremors through the stone. Cracks began appearing within the first hour. Defenders pressed themselves against the inner parapets, waiting for orders, listening to the fortress shake around them. Dobó had prepared them for this. He had told them the bombardment would be brutal, that the walls would suffer, that their job was to endure until the infantry came. When the infantry came, they would fight. Until then, they would hold their positions and trust the stone to do its work. By mid-morning, the infantry came. The first wave emerged from the Ottoman lines under cover of the continuing artillery fire. Hundreds of soldiers advanced up the slope toward the southern wall. Shields raised against arrows, engineers carrying ladders and tools, officers shouting commands to keep formations tight. They moved with the confidence of men who had done this before, who had watched fortress after fortress crumble under the same combination of cannon fire and disciplined assault. Eger would be no different. Halfway up the slope, something rolled toward them. The first barrel tumbled down the hill awkwardly, bouncing over rocks and ruts. Most of the advancing soldiers ignored it, debris from the bombardment they assumed, or some desperate attempt to slow their approach. A few stepped aside to let it pass. Others didn't bother. Then it exploded. The blast ripped outward in a wave of fire and shrapnel. Men closest to the detonation were thrown backward. Others caught flames on their shields and clothing. Before anyone could react, a second barrel came tumbling down, then a third, then a volley of smaller objects, clay pots that shattered on impact and erupted into clinging, burning chaos. The formations disintegrated. Soldiers who had been advancing in disciplined ranks were suddenly scrambling sideways, trying to escape the flames. Engineers dropped their tools and ran. Officers screamed orders that no one could hear over the noise. The advance that had looked unstoppable, moments earlier collapsed into confusion as fire spread across the slope and men stumbled over fallen comrades. From the walls, the defenders poured arrows and musket fire into the chaos. Stones crashed down on soldiers who had stopped moving. The Turks, who could still walk, retreated down the hill, dragging wounded with them, leaving equipment scattered across the scorched ground. For the first time in the campaign, the Ottoman army had been forced backward. For the first time, they hesitated. And inside Eger, the defenders realized something had changed. They could hurt these men. They could make them bleed. The impossible odds hadn't shifted, but the fear had. Now the Turks felt it too. The first day's victory bought them time. It didn't buy them safety. The Turks regrouped overnight. By the next morning, the cannons were firing again, the same relentless rhythm, the same punishing impacts on the southern wall. The Ottoman commanders had learned from the first assault. They adjusted their approach, sent smaller probing attacks to test defences, kept their main forces back while the artillery did its work. They weren't rushing anymore. They were grinding, and grinding was worse. Every morning began the same way, the boom of cannons at dawn, shaking defenders from whatever exhausted sleep they had managed, the walls trembling with each impact, dust hanging in the air so thick it coated throats and stung eyes. The crack in the southern wall spreading a little wider with every barrage, a visible countdown that everyone tried not to watch. Every afternoon brought the assaults. scaling ladders thrown against the walls, iron hooks flung at the parapets, waves of infantry climbing while archers provided cover from below. The defenders met them with everything they had. Spears thrust downward at exposed faces. Boiling water poured on men halfway up the ladders, stones dropped on helmets, shattering bone. When weapons broke or ran out, they fought with bare hands, shoving ladders backward, grappling with attackers who reached the top, doing whatever it took to keep the walls from being overrun. The nights offered no rest. Repair crews worked by torchlight, patching damage that would be undone by morning. Medical stations overflowed with wounded men who couldn't be spared from the walls. Soldiers ate standing up, slept in shifts measured in minutes, and returned to their positions before their bodies had recovered. Fatigue became its own enemy. Arms that had swung swords for hours grew heavy and slow. Legs that had stood on stone ramparts for days began to buckle. Soldiers fought with bandaged hands, with cracked ribs, with injuries that would have sent them to bed in peacetime. There was no peacetime. There was only the wall and the next wave and the desperate need to hold on a little longer. The casualties mounted, not in dramatic last stands, but in the slow arithmetic of attrition. A man killed by a musket ball, another crushed by falling stone, a defender who simply collapsed from exhaustion and couldn't get up again. Dobó tracked the numbers carefully, knowing that every loss made the next assault harder to repel. By the end of the first week, the southern wall was on the edge of collapse. The crack that had started as a thin line now ran deep enough to fit an arm inside. Chunks of stone fell inward with every bombardment. The engineers had done everything they could: timber bracing, earthen supports, desperate repairs between assaults. But everyone could see the truth. The wall was going to break. When it did, the Turks wouldn't need ladders anymore. They would pour through the gap like water through a broken dam. And there weren't enough defenders left to stop them. The only question was when. On the morning of the 9th day, the southern wall finally died. The collapse came without warning. One moment the weakened section was holding, trembling under another barrage. The next, a deep grinding sound tore through the air as stone gave way to gravity. A jagged gap opened in the wall, 10 feet wide, then 15, rubble cascading inward and outward in a cloud of choking dust. For a heartbeat, everything went silent. Then the Ottoman drums began to thunder. This was the moment the Turkish commanders had been waiting for. Standards lifted across the valley, officers screamed orders, thousands of infantry surged forward from their positions, converging on the breach like wolves scenting blood. This was the push meant to end the siege. This was the assault that would finally break Eger. The defenders didn't have time to think. They had trained for this. Soldiers formed ranks behind the fallen stones, using the rubble as cover. Civilians, who had been hauling supplies, dropped everything and dragged sandbags toward the gap, building desperate barricades even as the first attackers came scrambling over the debris. Bornemissza appeared with his remaining weapons, the most volatile mixtures he had saved for exactly this moment. The Turks hit the breach at a run. The fighting was immediate, violent, and impossibly close. There was no room for formations, no space for tactics, just steel meeting steel in a narrow gap choked with dust and screaming men. Defenders thrust spears into the mass of bodies pushing through. Attackers fired upward at point-blank range. Men grappled hand-to-hand on the rubble, slipping on loose stone and fallen comrades. Bornemissa's firepots arced into the breach. Explosions ripped through the attackers. Flames erupted among the tightly packed infantry, spreading panic as men tried to escape the burning chaos. But the Turks kept coming. Wave after wave pushed through the gap, climbing over their own dead, driving the defenders back step by step. For a moment, it looked like the end. The defenders were exhausted, outnumbered, overwhelmed. The barricades were buckling. The line was bending. One more push and the Turks would pour into the fortress interior. Then the wind shifted. It happened without warning. A sudden gust that caught the thick smoke from Turkish artillery and blew it backward into their own lines. Visibility collapsed. The assault formations, so disciplined moments before, stumbled into confusion. Officers couldn't see their men. Units lost track of the breach. Soldiers hesitated, unsure which direction to advance. The defenders didn't hesitate. They surged forward into the smoke, pikes leveled, driving into the disoriented attackers with everything they had left. Bornemissa's last firepots ignited along the slope, creating walls of flame that split the Turkish formations. Arrows rained from the towers into the chaos below. Every defender still standing, wounded, exhausted, half dead, threw themselves into the counterattack. The Turkish infantry broke, not all at once, but in pieces. First the men nearest the flames fell back, then the units behind them. Then the retreat became general, soldiers streaming down the slope away from the breach, away from the fire, away from the fortress that refused to fall. When the smoke finally cleared, the gap in the wall was still there, open, unrepaired, but no Turkish soldier stood inside it. The breach had been made. The fortress had not fallen. And somewhere in the Ottoman camp, commanders who had expected victory were staring at the hill in disbelief. That night, something strange happened in the valley below Eger. The drums stopped. For weeks, the Ottoman camp had pulsed with noise, the rhythm of artillery crews, the shouts of officers, the constant rumble of an army preparing for the next assault. Now there was nothing, just silence, spreading across the Turkish lines like a held breath. Inside the fortress, the defenders noticed. They were too exhausted to understand what it meant, too battered to feel hope. They simply stood at their positions, listening to the quiet, waiting for whatever came next. What came next was dawn, and with dawn came movement, but not the movement they expected. The Ottoman artillery crews weren't repositioning their guns, they were dismantling them. Teams of oxen were being harnessed to the massive bronze cannons, preparing to drag them away from the hills. Supply wagons that had been parked in neat rows were forming into columns. Infantry units were breaking down their tents, gathering their equipment, forming marching lines that pointed south, away from Eger, away from the fortress that had refused to fall. The withdrawal took most of the day. The defenders watched from the shattered walls as the army that had seemed unstoppable slowly emptied from the valley. First the artillery, the great guns that had pounded them for weeks, disappearing down the roads they had arrived on. Then the infantry, regiment after regiment, marching past the fortress they had failed to take. Then the endless supply train, wagons, animals, camp followers, streaming southward until the valley was empty. No one in Eger celebrated. There was no cheering, no songs, no triumphant speeches. The defenders were too broken for that. Many simply sat where they had fought, leaning against cracked walls and ruined barricades, staring at the emptying field with expressions that held no joy, just exhaustion, just the slow, disbelieving realization that they were still alive. The fortress hadn't won through strength. It hadn't crushed the Ottoman army in some glorious battle. It had simply lasted longer than the enemy believed possible. It had absorbed everything thrown at it, the bombardment, the assaults, the breach itself, and refused to break. And in the end, that refusal had been enough. Dobó walked the walls that evening, stepping over rubble and fallen stones, looking at the men and women who had held when everything said they should have fallen. He didn't give speeches. He didn't need to. They had done what he asked. They had done more than anyone had a right to expect. In the years that followed, the siege of Eger became legend. Stories spread across Hungary, across Europe. The tale of 2,000 defenders who held against 40,000, of fire weapons and desperate courage, of a fortress that became a symbol, proof that ingenuity could triumph over numbers, that discipline could outlast brute force, that ordinary people, farmers, craftsmen, soldiers, women, children, could shape history when they refused to surrender. Eger didn't stop the Ottoman Empire. It didn't turn the tide of the war. The frontier would keep shifting, more fortresses would fall, but Eger held. And for the people who fought behind its walls, who bled and burned and refused to break, that was enough. Sometimes that's all history needs.